Hello and welcome to BBC News broadcasting in the UK and around the world. The BBC understands that a United Nations panel investigating whether WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is unlawfully detained at an embassy in London has ruled in his favour. Assange has been at the Ecuadorian embassy for more than 3 years as he fights extradition to Sweden for questioning over an alleged sexual assault. In the early hours of this morning, Mr. Assange tweeted that he'd turn himself into police tomorrow if the panel ruled against him. But if it ruled in his favour, he wants his passport back. Scotland Yard said this morning they'd arrest Assange if he leaves the embassy. Well, let's go now to the Ecuadorian embassy. Richard Lister is there for us. And I suppose the main point in all of this, Richard, is that the UN panel has no jurisdiction over what the authorities here in the UK do.
That's right, they don't. Certainly their word has some clout. They are an official UN body and they have made judgments in such important cases as that of Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar in the past. So they are an important body, but as you say, what they officially declare tomorrow when they make this ruling official is not something that the UK has to abide by. Now, Julian Assange clearly feels that the United Kingdom should certainly abide by whatever this UN body rules. He said that had they decided that they would throw his case out, then he would hand over his passport. As the BBC understands it, the UN body is actually going to rule in his favour, and he says that means that he should be allowed to keep his passport and fly to Ecuador, where of course he's been given political asylum. And that's what this all comes down to. Ecuador, the embassy behind me, gave him political asylum because of his fear of persecution by the United States over the release of secret American information by his WikiLeaks organisation. But he's never been able to go to Ecuador because the UK police say they would arrest him if he left. And of course that has been reiterated today.
So we wait, to hear, I suppose, from Julian Assange himself, because the possibility remains that if he does now step outside that embassy, that he could be arrested. So the status quo could prevail, Richard, couldn't it?
It very well could, and to be honest, that seems the most likely situation as things stand. Now, when Mr. Assange made his statement in the early hours of this morning, it gave the impression that he had not been informed which way this tribunal was going to rule. In fact, the BBC understands that both Britain and Sweden, whose actions have been investigated as part of this investigation by this UN working group, had already been informed about this in December. It's an open question as to whether they reached out to Julian Assange as well. Certainly the statement that he made in the small hours of this morning gave the impression that perhaps there was some element of doubt as to which way they would rule. In any event, the BBC understands that they will rule in his favour. He will then almost certainly say to the British authorities, you need to give me back my passport and allow me safe passage to Ecuador. But it seems just as likely that the UK authorities will say, I'm sorry, we don't feel bound to abide by this ruling by this UN working group.
OK, Richard, thank you for that. Richard Lister outside the Ecuadorian embassy in central London.
Now, the BBC understands that a United Nations panel which is investigating whether the WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is unlawfully detained at an embassy in London is going to rule in his favour. Mr. Assange has been at the Ecuadorian embassy for more than 3 years, fighting extradition to Sweden, and that's for questioning over an alleged sexual assault. There are allegations which he denies. But let's go to the Ecuadorian embassy, or at least outside it now in central London. Richard Lister is there. Richard, he was talking about handing himself up tomorrow. Obviously, he'll be pleased. What does this amount to?
Yes, what we should remember really is that at the heart of this is that back in 2012, the Ecuadorian government gave Julian Assange political asylum, i.e. he could live in Ecuador without fear of extradition to any other country, particularly the United States, which of course is pursuing an investigation of the release by WikiLeaks of sensitive American information. Now, when it became clear that if he left this embassy in order to go to Ecuador, Mr. Assange would be arrested, did, he then asked the UN to look into whether that was a breach of his rights as somebody who's been granted political asylum. And the BBC understands that this panel will come back and say, yes, he is correct, that this is in breach of his rights as somebody who's been granted political asylum. He should be free to go to Ecuador to take up that offer made by the Ecuadorian government. Now, Mr. Assange said at the outset that if they ruled against him, he would be available for arrest by the British authorities, but otherwise he will expect the return of his passport and a guarantee of safe passage to Ecuador.
So this shifts, presumably, the emphasis and the pressure, to a certain extent, on the British government?
Yes, I think it does to some extent. This UN working group is fairly high profile in that it has intervened in the case, for example, of Aung San Suu Kyi in the past and other high profile figures. But at the same time, while it has some influence, it doesn't have any legal impact. The government of the United Kingdom is not bound by its decision, and even though it hasn't been formally announced, as I say, we do understand that it has ruled in his favour, and already the British police have come out this morning and said that they will still regard him as being somebody who they will arrest if Mr. Assange leaves the Ecuadorian embassy here.
On the UN, we still wait, I should just say, for a formal decision from the UN investigating panel, but it does look as if it will be exactly what Julian Assange was hoping to hear. Now,